Hello and welcome to another episode of Conversations in the Future of Work. I'm your host, Rachel Cossar, co-founder and CEO at Virtual Sapiens. And today I am thrilled to be joined by the irreplaceable Dr. Abbie Maroño. So I'm going to pass it over to you to share just a little bit about your background and why it is that you're so excited and jazzed about where we're going in the future of work.
Thank you for such a warm introduction, Rachel, as always. I'm Dr. Abbie Maroño. I'm a behavioral scientist and the director of education at Social Engineer. I have a PhD in psychology, specializing in behavioral analysis. And I'm very excited about where we're going and looking at how you're using nonverbal communication in the virtual realm, because I think the whole world is going virtual. Really, we know that after the pandemic, and the research on nonverbal communication is only just starting to go virtual. So I love what you're doing, turning this into physical training. So I'm really excited about everything you're doing and where the research is going.
Awesome. Yes. And just so everyone knows, so Dr. Maroño is one of our advisors at Virtual Sapiens. So we get to work very closely together and excited to have you on the show.
Excited to be here.
So, in terms of our first question, today we're focusing on building trust and rapport in virtual environments. So, just so everyone's on the same page, in your view, how are trust and rapport similar? How are they different? Like, how do you define these two concepts?
Well, trust is, there's no very clear, specific definition of trust because there's different types of trust. There's cognitive trust, there's emotional trust, and things like that. But trust is really about vulnerability. Do I trust that I can be vulnerable with you and you won't exploit that vulnerability? So it's really, for me, about safety. Do I feel safe providing you something, whether it's being in your physical presence, providing you information, or interacting with you? Rapport is really about that interpersonal dynamic. So rapport is about the general positivity of an interaction. So rapport can encompass trust, but rapport can also encompass things like likability, closeness, familiarity. And again, rapport isn't perfectly defined, but it really is just about that positivity between individuals. For rapport, you don't necessarily need trust. There's lots of people that we can feel close to and like and have good rapport with, but not necessarily trust, and wouldn't feel safe providing them really personal information. But for trust, you need rapport. You wouldn't trust anybody that you don't have rapport with. So I would say that rapport is a precursor to a trusting relationship.
Okay. Wow. That's such an interesting distinction and an important one because I
Yeah.
think oftentimes what I hear is things like trust, rapport, and empathy get kind of
Yes.
mushed together.
Yep. So do concepts like interpersonal closeness, which really is about how close I feel to you psychologically, how I define myself by my relationship with you. And all of these concepts are so similar and overlapping, but they are distinct. And I think trust specifically really is distinct because trust is a one-way thing. So you can have trust between individuals, but it is a personal, I can trust someone and they might not trust me. Whereas rapport really is that interpersonal aspect of what's the positivity between us. You can feel rapport with someone and them not feel rapport with you, but that idea of rapport really is that interpersonal aspect.
Right, right. That makes sense. So let's go a little deeper on
Yep.
this concept of trust.
Yes.
So my next question is, what elements of building trust and being perceived as trustworthy can you actually control? And this is specifically within the mindset of nonverbals and nonverbal behaviors.
Yep. So I love that you said perceived, because people often think that you can use nonverbals to appear trustworthy, or you can read nonverbals of trustworthiness and they're accurate. Now, nonverbals are all about perception. So I can make sure that I'm displaying trustworthiness And that's just about, am I perceived as trustworthy? It doesn't necessarily represent my actual trustworthiness. You might be a very trustworthy person, but not be very non-verbally intelligent. And that doesn't discredit your actual character, but what it means is you're not doing yourself justice. And trust and trustworthiness are related, but again, distinct. Trustworthiness is something you show. Trust is something that is built. So for there to be trust, you have to be perceived as trustworthy, but it doesn't mean you will be given trust. But if you're not perceived as trustworthy, you probably won't. So it is really important. And when it comes to being perceived as trustworthy, again, like you said, focusing on nonverbals is the greatest way to be perceived as trustworthy, because trust is built within milliseconds. 33 milliseconds, we make a judgment of whether someone is perceived as trustworthy or not. And that judgment is resistant to change. And that is all through nonverbals. So we make a judgment of trustworthiness prior to speaking to that individual. So the only thing we have to go off is that nonverbal expression.
Right. I think there's often a disconnect between how people interpret nonverbals and what that person might actually be like, right? I think it's easy to like we've evolved to make these kinds of snap judgments for our safety, right? As human beings, but then you have to be really careful with actually leaning in and allowing some of those judgments to reflect back on you, who you think this person may be. We see the same thing frequently with facial expressions. Like the difference between a detected facial expression and a felt sense of emotion are very different, right? Someone can be feeling quite at ease and attentive, but their facial expression reads as angry or completely disinterested, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing, because our nonverbals do show our inner states. Absolutely. That's what they've evolved to do. They've evolved to communicate, and they are a behavioral manifestation of our internal states and of our nervous system reactions, of course. However, we do have a perception management ability. So when I'm teaching nonverbals, when I'm teaching it as an observer, I say, look past the nonverbals. What's the consistency of behavior? What are the verbals saying? Is there a mismatch between the two channels? When I'm teaching someone as a sender, I'm teaching them how to make sure their nonverbals are as appearing trustworthy as possible. So there's both sides of it, and you really want to be well informed on both sides, so you can make sure that as a sender, you are giving yourself the best chance to create a positive interaction. But as an observer, you're not being swayed too much by the nonverbals. So it definitely is not necessarily counterintuitive, but contradictory. But that is the way that it works.
Right. Absolutely. And that distinction is so between like, what can you do as someone who's presenting or speaking or communicating? What are the choices you want to make to ensure that the message you intend to send is congruent with the nonverbals you're displaying, right? Like, that's one bucket of muscle development. And then on the other side of it, it's as a reader of nonverbals, right? Yeah, you definitely want to be looking for more than just these isolated cues that maybe you read somewhere that crossed arms means that this person's closed, right? And it's like, actually, maybe not.
And I think what's important is when we teach nonverbals to say how to appear trustworthy, it's not a case of how to fake trustworthiness. I encourage you to show trustworthy behaviors, be consistently trustworthy, absolutely. But a lot of people really struggle with actually using their behaviors to show their emotions, to show that they feel positive, to show they are active listening. And we want to make sure we give them the upper hand, the best ability to do so. We don't say, how to appear trustworthy and actually be manipulative.
Right.
Because if you're having a long-term interaction, that's going to be obvious, because it's very difficult to engage in strict impression management across a long period of time, because our true behaviors do come out and then people feel deceived. And we never encourage that. But we do want to make sure that people who are trustworthy and people who do want to facilitate cooperation and have a positive interaction, they have access to understand what skills they need to display. Because confidence is something that is often very difficult to obtain, and it is difficult to show, but it is very, very important. And we wouldn't say, oh, you're not confident, so therefore don't display it. We want to say, even if you don't feel it, this is how you appear confident. And then through the appearance of confidence, you can learn confidence. So it's really about creating positive interactions and giving yourself and others the best way to have that upper hand, not about trying to be manipulative and pretend to be trustworthy and not being trustworthy.
Right. It's so interesting. I feel like people are going to have to go through this conversation a number of times because like the level of nuance is pretty specific.
Yeah.
Like, it's like Amy Cuddy's work wherein you can have the way you assemble your body can actually influence your own affect and the way that you perceive yourself in a moment. So you can almost use the nonverbals to help you get from one state into another state. But you want to be careful about that. Like, it's like, then you're like, okay, so how do I balance that with like being authentic and like not manipulating?
And it takes practice. It's like you said, that you might have to go back and listen a couple of times, because people think that nonverbals is so simple. And it is simple, but just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy.
Right.
It's like any skill where it takes time and it takes practice. And the way we hold ourselves and even the way we talk to ourselves affects how we feel. For example, we know that standing up straight with the shoulders back and having a very strong posture makes you feel more confident.
Right.
When you slouch, you feel less confident. But also, before we do something, say I'm looking in the mirror and I go, I can't do it. Well, what do you think happens? More cortisol is released, which makes it harder for me to do it effectively. If I stand in the mirror and I go, you got this. This is great. We feel confident. We can do this. We're excited. I feel the nerves, but I've got this. Cortisol isn't going to be increased in that level. So I'm going to give myself a better ability and a better chance to go out and do it effectively. So the way we speak to ourselves, the way we hold ourselves really does affect our abilities. Even if it's just a little nudge in the right direction, that little nudge is still a nudge. It's still what we want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Small changes and small rewirings over time, I think, is where
absolutely
that sustained change can happen.
Yeah. I love what you said as well, over time.
Yes.
Because I think there's a lot of courses that will say, you do this 2-hour course and you're going to be a nonverbal communication expert, or you take this one class and you're going to be a deception detection expert. And it's pseudoscientific. And that's not how the human brain works. That's not how we work. We need consistent practice, consistent change over time, because we need things to become natural to us. If I'm saying, okay, I need to make sure that I'm smiling and I'm being expressive and I'm being bold and sitting up straight, and I say all of that at once, it's going to create cognitive overload. And I'm going to look really silly. We want to make small, consistent changes over time until those behaviors become part of my natural behavioral repertoire. And then I make another small little tweak, and then another small tweak, until it is natural, until it looks authentic, not like I'm saying, okay, what do I need to show? What do I need to show now? What do I need to show next?
Yeah, absolutely. So on this topic of kind of being authentic with it and building new muscles and whatnot, there's a concept that I think a lot of people want to understand better and sometimes maybe don't quite get right. So what is nonverbal mimicry and how does that all factor into this conversation?
I'm so glad you asked. This is my favorite topic. This is what I did my PhD in. How to use nonverbal mimicry to influence information elicitation. And any chance to talk about this, I will talk about this. So nonverbal mimicry, there's different types of mimicry. So mimicry overall, we have things like emotional mimicry, which is facial mimicry. And then nonverbal mimicry is mimicry of the body. For example, say you're stood with your hand on your hip with one leg dipped. I might unconsciously adopt that exact posture. And then I do it not because I'm copying you, I do it because it's an unconscious automatic reaction. And this mimicking of posture creates a feeling of closeness, familiarity. It's a behavioral overlap that creates a psychological overlap, is the way I try to think about it. And you can use this strategically. So although it happens unconsciously, when you understand how to use it without being overt, so, if you raise your arm and I raise my arm instantly after, or if I copy every behavior you do, it's overt. It's not subtle. It's not going to be mimicry. It's going to be mocking, basically. So when you understand how to use it strategically and effectively, you can absolutely use it to create cooperation. And there is tons and tons of literature, so much so that mimicry is called a social glue phenomena. It creates this social glue by facilitating harmonious personal and interpersonal interactions. And it's also been called a cooperation enhancing mechanism because it does have this really unique ability to create cooperation between individuals.
Right. So follow up to that, right, is it's I think people can kind of understand that and grasp that when we're
Yep.
in person. But what
Yes.
about on video?
Again, I'm so glad you asked because this was study 4 of my PhD. There wasn't really any literature on this because the realm of mimicry isn't new. It's very, very lasting, and there's some great older research on it. But in terms of the virtual world, there really wasn't anything. So I wanted to know if we could create cooperation by mimicking online. And there's a funny story of how I did this study. When my supervisor said that we need to do it online because of COVID, I said, well, there's no point. It's not going to be effective online. And as I was saying that, one of my supervisors was like, well, you're mimicking Stacy right now. And I looked and I had completely copied every way that she was sitting, how she had her hands, how I had my head directed. And I just said, okay, well, we'll do it. And just as it is in person, it works exactly the same online. So again, you don't want to be too overt, but say someone changes their posture, maybe tilts their head, nods their head, we'll do the same.
Mm-hmm.
Mimic them. Not every time they do it. Again, subtle and timing is important,
Mm-hmm.
but it does create cooperation. And interestingly, if you observe two other people mimicking, so say you have two business partners interacting with a client, if the business partners are in sync with each other and their behaviors look in unison, well, the client is more feels more positive and more cooperative to both parties. Just
Mm-hmm.
observing mimicry makes us more cooperative.
Right, right. Which it's just that's so
Yeah.
fascinating that it translates onto video as well. I mean,
Yep.
we know this, and as you mentioned earlier in your introduction, like the research now is really coming out, right?
Yes.
And thanks to researchers such as yourself, we can actually know that these tools are or these concepts are out there, these phenomena are out there, and that they're
Yeah.
reflective on video. And if they're reflective on video, they can be observed on video, they can be leveraged on video. It becomes very
Yep.
powerful.
Yep. And I think as awful as COVID was, it did really shake up the literature on nonverbals
Right.
because so much now started to happen virtually. So we were forced to realize, all of this information that I focus on, I now can't. And this little box that I'm in and just my face and my upper body carry a lot of importance. And I think people went one way or the other,
Mm-hmm.
where some people, this is something that is fantastic. And now I have more control because I can harness this little box and make sure that I give my nonverbals the best opportunity. And then on the other side, you have people that go, oh, well, now we're virtual. And like I said, I did that a little bit too at the beginning. I was
Right.
like, oh, we're virtual, so it's not going to be as effective. What's the point? And they're the ones really missing out on that richness. to enhance their interpersonal interactions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. Definitely. I had a conversation at a conference just last week, and one gentleman was very much of the latter opinion, where he was like, yeah, but on video, all body language goes out of control because, or out the window, because all you can see is the person's head. And I'm like, well, you don't, like, if the person's framed themselves properly, you can actually see almost just as much as you would see if we were sitting at a table across from one another. So there's actually a lot going for us on video in terms of nonverbals.
Yep. And if you can only see their face and the camera quality isn't good, well, that says a lot too, because that creates a really negative first impression.
Mm-hmm.
So the people that say, oh, well, it's not important, so I won't have my camera on, or I'm not bothered about a high quality camera or what my body is doing. Great, you might not be. But what you're doing is now limiting your social interactions. You're now limiting your ability to create cooperation, to create that positive interpersonal interaction.
Mm-hmm. Right. And what I always like to say about nonverbals in general is, whether you like it or not, you're sending a message.
Yep.
So,
yeah. You can say, oh, well, I don't care. Great. Don't care. If you don't think that it's important, don't think it's important. But people are still going to be responding to your nonverbals, whether you like it or not.
Yes.
So you might as well give yourself the best chance. And I think that this isn't necessarily anybody's fault. I think there is so much misinformation out there about nonverbals that a couple of things happen. People see this misinformation and they try and use it, and it's ineffective. So they go, oh, well, nonverbals is just hocus pocus. Or they recognize the pseudoscientific nature of it and go, oh, well, the field is hocus pocus in general. And it's really a shame because there's so much fantastic research out there and there's so much fantastic work being done, but it does get overshadowed by this pseudoscience. And it's because when we oversell the importance of nonverbals and when we oversell what nonverbals can do, it's appealing. It makes money if you say, oh, you do this expression and you're going to be the richest person ever, or you're going to get these amazing responses. I'm like, yeah, I would buy that. But then it soon becomes aware that that's ineffective. And the actual realities don't always sell as well of, it gives you a good nudge in the right direction. That first sales pitch sounds way more exciting, but it isn't really how it works. So again, that real beauty of the science does get overshadowed. But when you dive into it and really see what can be done, when we look at things like how to appear trustworthy, how to create cooperation, and we make sure we get our information from reliable sources, there's a lot that can be done.
Right. Absolutely. And so it's funny because the final question that I was going to ask you to wrap this up relates to everything you just said. Like, what are some of the things that are so misunderstood about nonverbals? And I feel like you just perfectly answered that, which is wonderful. So I'm going to wrap up, Abbie, because these are intended to just be short and sweet. But in saying thank you so much for being here, I'd love to give you the opportunity to share any ways that our audience might be able to either follow more of your work or connect with you directly.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. I think we could have talked for hours.
As usual.
And we probably still will. But you can find me on my website, which is just abbieMaroño.com. And I have a link to all of my socials, my podcast, my coaching. But my socials are also Dr. Abbie Maroño at LinkedIn. And I believe Dr. Abbie Official on Instagram.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you again for your time and for sharing your amazing insights. I always go a little deeper when we talk, so I appreciate that. And we'll continue on another time.
Absolutely. Looking forward to the next one already.
Great. Thank you.